Hello and welcome to Meeting People with me, Amal Pandya. Meeting People is a podcast where I have long conversations with rebellious, adventurous and sometimes courteous free spirits. Hello everyone, hello Eugene. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I don't normally do this, but because it's a bit of a mouthful, I'm actually going to read out a tiny little bio.
Okay.
So basically you're the Research Fellow at the Centre for Decision Research and Experimental Economics. And you've also founded the Collective Decision Making and Culture Lab, or the CDMCL, which is an interdisciplinary group. Not an interdisciplinary group. It's lots of discipline, I'm sure. Sometimes. It's an interdisciplinary group of 71 researchers based in 38 countries worldwide, aiming to bring global perspectives to the study of collective action problems. And you're also a research fellow at CogCo, where you help companies apply insights from behavioural science to improve lives at scale. So we're going to unpack all of that in some way, shape or form, or try to at the very least. And obviously, well, not obviously to the people listening, but to me, you've done a PhD on the tragedy of the commons, or based around that.
Yeah.
And I'd love you to define that at some point. But before we do all of that, can you just give me an idea of what got you into, like, when did you first realise you had a interest in human behaviour, in the science of that behaviour, and kind of when did that blossom?
I think it goes back to, I'm tempted to say, watching Derren Brown.
Yeah.
And reading what he was doing and seeing him, and that, I think, was a moment for me, a realization where you suddenly see, oh my God, all these decisions that I thought I was making, that I was entirely in control of, there are actually a million other forces at play, and maybe I'm influenced by those forces, and maybe I'm not quite as in control of my own destiny and all of my decisions in a way that I thought I was. Yeah. So I think he got me going down that line, and then I started reading more, and I picked up Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I was watching lots of videos of Rory Sutherland, who I know you're a big fan of, on YouTube.
He's come up once or twice on the old podcast.
And so all of these things were just contributing to a wider acknowledgement of, oh, actually, this is fascinating. The way that we make decisions in the world is always interesting. And so I wanted to study that in a bit more detail. So
decision-making in simple situations and complex situations.
For sure, but also just, what makes us happy. We're not particularly good at realising the things that are going to make us happy, and we spend our lives sometimes doing things and repeating the same mistakes and living in a certain way without necessarily knowing ourselves and what that might mean.
Yeah. Well, look, I not as deep as you, but I've been down the old rabbit hole of, the question of happiness, the question of, biases, and it's very much entered our lexicon now. Things like, I like to drop into a conversation. That's classic confirmation bias. That is, it's sounding all kind of, I've read a bit of Kahneman, and but the journey where I'm at on my journey at the moment is that actually it's great narrative stuff, and companies are talking about it. But is this real science? Does it repeat? Do the experiments that were done 20, 30 years ago? Do they scale to kind of group problems in the way that they do for individuals, and because we're all so different?
Yeah.
And B, is it something that you can genuinely get insights from, because we don't know what happiness is?
Yeah. True. So does it replicate? Is a great question. This is something that within psychology and economics is being debated a lot at the moment, and there's lots of things that people are doing to try to ensure that things that we think are scientific facts actually do replicate. If they're findings from experiments, do they replicate? So, for example, one thing you have to do now before you run a study, or you don't have to, but it's best practice, is to say, well, here's what I'm studying, and here are all my hypotheses, and here's how I'm planning to test them. And that avoids a situation where you run a study and then you say, oh, I found this interesting stuff that I wasn't originally interested in. It's not to say that those kinds of findings can't be important, and obviously this pre-registration is not to try to shut that down. It's just to at least make sure that you're not kind of digging around for significant findings. That's the idea. But in reality, I think ultimately experimental psychology and experimental economics is trying to establish a science of human behavior in a way that scientists from other disciplines have done it, right? In medicine, you run a randomized controlled trial where you give a random half the people a pill and the other half you don't. And then you see, okay, well, what was the effect here? But whenever you're dealing with people, which I guess you are to some extent in a medical trial, but maybe more physiologically, whenever you're dealing with behavior, there's a million, like I said before, there's a million factors that might be at play, and it's very difficult to, create the exact same conditions that you had first time round that replicate second time round, but also, to take your point about scaling, to know whether what you've found here in the lab or in your study will either replicate or scale further. So I'm increasingly finding that the scaling problem is a big one.
So do you overlap into complexity theory as well?
No, I actually stay clear of complexity theory. I mean, it's an interesting, but I've not done much. Are you a fan?
Well, only because, very basic, rudimentary kind of front page with top paragraph Wikipedia knowledge depth here, but behaviors that there's Aristotle kind of said behave in the way that if everyone in the world behaved that way, the world would be a better place. And I think that is kind of not particularly accurate, because you've probably heard the saying, you want to be a communist at home in the family, you want to be a socialist in the village, but you want to be a capitalist when it comes to the nation, because the communist behavior doesn't scale the more people you bring into it. And so that in complexity theory is emergent properties that come, the bigger something gets. If you make a human being 10 times bigger, it's not going to be 10 times stronger. Actually, the lung's going to collapse and it's not going to be able to pump circulation around. So you get these kind of emergent properties, which I thought is where I've read some of the criticism of your field of discipline, in that it's hard to make it scientific because it's such a complex domain. Whereas physics is kind of universally true, whether it's in this room or it's in the universe.
Yeah. Well, although we could get into quantum physics, which might say that the standard physics is true. Some of those assumptions. I think you're right. The scaling thing is interesting, even from taking a really simple example where you think something could scale quite easily, right? So there was this thing that HMRC have done for a few years, where they send letters to people who are late paying their taxes, and they just add a sentence to the letter, right, saying 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. Did you know this? And that is actually quite a low-cost intervention, and seems to encourage people to pay their tax a bit more. But even if you take that to Ireland, they've tried this in Ireland. It doesn't work in Ireland because Irish people go, oh, well, those 9 out of 10 are
those idiots.
yeah, exactly. So even, you're not taking that in a particularly contrasting cultural direction. You're just taking it to Ireland, and already it doesn't quite work. So yeah, scaling is an issue, and emergence, really interesting stuff, right? It's not a collection of individuals. There's something greater that happens when these people come together. And this is, we'll get into collective action problems later, but this is the whole challenge, is for so many of these global problems, is that it's not 3 people involved, it's 5 billion, 8 billion. Yeah.
And it's amazing how you get different cultures behaving in different ways when it comes to small things like queuing or littering or adhering to lockdowns or whatever it might be. Did you notice during that kind of, I'm guessing you were over COVID, it was like, putting the tragedy to one side, it must have been a fascinating time for you to kind of learn about how the world works.
Yeah, totally. And there were a huge number of people looking at this, because you suddenly had what you might call a natural experiment, right? And this is often what you're trying to do in the lab, is to try to understand whether people will follow rules. Because if you ask people, would you hypothetically follow these rules? They might tell you something, but then in practice, it's difficult to know the relationship between those things. Whereas with COVID, obviously, you had this several things. To what extent are people wearing masks or complying? Why are they complying? How is that different across cultures? What's happening there? It was a real hotbed. I didn't get too involved in that research, but we did this study on confirmation bias around the time of COVID, and what we did is randomly assign people to one of two groups and gave them a bit of information about a vaccine. So it was a little table, and it said how many people got vaccinated and whether they got COVID or not. And so it required a bit of maths to figure out whether the vaccine was effective.
Right.
Okay. And to one of the groups, we gave a table that showed that the vaccine was effective if you did the maths. Not very difficult maths. And the other group got some information which showed the vaccine was ineffective. And because we'd asked them about their prior beliefs about vaccines, we knew, okay, are those prior beliefs going to affect the way that they interpret this information in the table? And as you might expect from a confirmation bias perspective, you essentially get the people who are anti-vaxxers, whatever the table says, they say, no, the vaccine's not effective. But it's also the pro-vaxxers, even when you show a table that the vaccine's not effective, they say, no, it still works.
Yeah.
So it just comes back to this point of decision-making being influenced by multiple factors, and maybe giving people information is not always the best, most effective way to try to change behaviour.
Is it a curse being aware of this stuff? Do you find yourself kind of paralysed by conviction, lack of conviction, or you need a bit of dogmatism in your life to kind of actually proceed? And is it challenging? Am I?
No. I think the only time I think it's a curse is
for other people.
I know it's mainly when I interact with companies in some way, or online interfaces, and I know that all the tricks that they're trying to do to get you to subscribe and then get you to forget to subscribe, they're all just using the same sort of things from this sort of behavioural science playbook to their advantage. So I think that's where it's a curse, because I feel like I'm just aware that all these companies are constantly trying to get you to do stuff that, whether that's in your best interest or not, is an open question.
Okay, so I wasn't planning to go here, but in your mind, what is it that makes it so hard to not look at your phone? No, I mean, if there's one example of technology or companies using our behaviour, not against us, but for us to use their product as much as possible, it's through social media and technology. What is going on in the brain that finds it so hard to kind of not, you ask anyone, I don't want to do this, I'd be happier if I didn't do it.
I think I'd say that I watched a video with Tristan Harris, who runs this
social. He did the Netflix thing.
Yeah,
social
exactly.
Dilemma.
Yeah. And he actually has another video called the AI dilemma. So he had the social dilemma and then the AI dilemma, which is quite interesting. And one of the things that he said is you have to imagine that when you're on Instagram, you might be thinking, okay, it's time to close this down now. But there's behind the phone, there's 1,000 people who are paid a huge amount of money to find ways to get you to stay on for a little bit longer. Yeah. So it's of course it's an uphill battle, because you're just you, and they've got all the data and some great people working on these things, or some great minds working on these things to try to keep you on there. But at the same time, if you're aware of some of the behavioural tendencies, and you can take actions. I mean, that, right, well, I'm just going to leave my phone on Do Not Disturb all day, and I'm going to put it in a different room, to make it a little bit less easy for me to immediately interact with it as soon as it tries to get my attention in some way.
Yeah. I mean, that feels like the most common solution that people have is to kind of make it hard to access, rather than train yourself to kind of practice abstinence with it in front of you, and you kind of learn to kind of, slap yourself every time your hand reaches to it. Actually, that doesn't work, that kind of willpower approach.
No, much easier just to don't even go there. Yeah.
So as you know, the kind of the premise of this podcast is to speak to people who are free-spirited in some way and have a sort of rebellious or contradictory or approach to their being. You've done a bit of work on reactance. What is rebelliousness something that's in all of us, or is it something that is particular to a certain type of person? What is reactance to you, and what's your take on it?
I think it's a cultural thing. I think it probably comes up more in England than it does in other countries, because in England, our psychology is such that we are an individual, we're an autonomous individual at the centre, and then there are all these other spheres of society that we kind of dip in and out of from time to time, and so when something threatens to impinge or hinder our autonomy, that's difficult for us, and so maybe we do react more strongly than somewhere like Japan, where you don't really exist as an individual in the same way. You're in a sort of sphere that everything is one, and so there's less of that, like the state versus me, or the market versus me. There are a few of these tensions to prompt reactance.
Yeah, there's the unit of account, particularly from either the global south or the Far East, however you want to call it, where the unit of account tends to be the family, whereas in the West the unit of account is the individual, it's per capita, rather than per household is what kind of drives. Is that problematic?
For sure, it can be. I think, but that's probably the first step to realise, is that we are probably the most individualistic country in the world. I mean, I guess you take America, but in some way that's related, right? Because of the history there. So massively problematic. The cult of the individual. I don't know how well we're doing from a well-being perspective. For example, we had a mental health report published, I think about 3 months ago. It was a detailed questionnaire. I think there were 72 countries, and the UK came second bottom after Uzbekistan. So there are some great things about individualism, right? You get a huge amount of autonomy and freedom to do what you like with your life. You get to choose who to marry, you get to choose who to hang out with, what job you want to do. These are all freedoms that don't necessarily exist in lots of different parts of the world. But there's a cost to that, because you bear the brunt of everything. Every decision you make that's your responsibility. And there's interesting historical reasons for why that came about. So I think one of the unique things about England was we had wills, and trusts were baked into the legal system quite early on.
Right.
So, in Europe and the rest of the world, you just got your family's you just inherited your parents' worth, whatever happened. Whereas in England, that's not really the default. You had to be written into the will specifically. So with everything, there's positives
I've
and
certainly
negatives.
noticed, I mean, culturally, coming from an Indian background, but growing up here, things that surprised my parents or me were, just small things like parents charging kids rent, kids going through a rough time of it, but you made your bed, so a bit more often than would happen, let's say, in the Far East. But I'd like to not challenge you on, but just double click on is America. Is it us, but more so because of that puritanical inheritance? They're the ones they were the adventurous ones, in inverted commas, that left Britain because they hated the authority of the Church of England and the Catholic Church, and they had that sort of that streak of evangelicalism to go off. And then once they got there was the ones that went to the frontier and then kept going forwards and forwards and forwards, to the point now where I feel like Britain is caught in its feet in two camps. It's kind of one foot in the European camp of welfare, social security, regulation, stability, not much risk taking, or all of those things, but at the expense of the upside. Whereas in America, you've got Musk, you've got Silicon Valley, you've got like billionaires who are going out there and they're celebrated, failures are celebrated.
Yeah.
You get out there and you give something a go, but at the cost of that collective nest. Is that the right term?
It could be, yeah. I mean, I think with the America thing, the adventurer idea, I mean, we don't necessarily see the same thing with Australia. You could say a similar thing has happened there, but they don't seem to have this like individualistic drive in the same way that the Americans do. So I think that's maybe true, but more complicated than that. But I think it's a great example of a country that shows where individualism and that form of capitalism can take you. You know, it's the most powerful country in the world and has been for a long time, and economically even now it's on all the metrics doing very well, all the top line metrics, but in other ways the social fabric of that society seems to be kind of breaking apart and fragmenting in some quite concerning ways, plus when you throw in the kind of inequality there as well. So it's interesting because it's on one side positive, but obviously there's costs there.
So GDP is a very crude metric, which people, you know, it has its merits, owing to its simplicity and its ability to kind of cross-compare over time and across countries, but which may be its greatest strength, but it obviously has been taken too far in some camps as the be-all and end-all. You know, the whole Einstein thing of not everything that counts can be counted, not everything that can be counted counts. But like, can you count happiness? Can you metricize it or put it in an index?
I think you can do things that try to get at it. I mean, not only are you counting things that can't be counted in GDP, you're counting things that are detrimental to human welfare. I mean, you know, bombs are a good example. There's someone called Richard Easterlin. Have you come across the Easterlin paradox? Go on. He observed a few decades ago now that what you tend to see if you measure happiness over time, and this is mostly by asking people certain questions like, to what extent are you know, how satisfied are you with life these days? To what extent do you feel that the things that you do in life are worthwhile? How happy were you yesterday? How anxious were you yesterday? You know, these are all ways of trying to understand how healthy do you think you are. They're all ways of trying to understand how people are embedded in their communities, how they're doing generally. If you look at well-being measures, and then you look at what happens to GDP can go up over several decades, but well-being stays exactly the same. So that's why it's called the Easterlin paradox, because the assumption is that we all get wealthier, we all get happier, but it's not how it turns out in practice.
So what happens? You're wealthier, but someone else is wealthier than you're wealthy. So you kind of is it an inequality problem?
Yeah, that's one of the mechanisms, is that your expectations just get higher, and you're always looking up, and everyone's wealthier, so you don't feel any wealthier because you're just as wealthy compared to everyone else as you were before. So often what seems to matter more is your wealth relative to other people, right? If you jump a load of places in the income distribution, you probably will get a bit happier because suddenly you've got more money to spend compared to other people. But if everyone's incomes increase, then there's no equivalent increase in happiness for everyone. It's a bit more complicated than that.
And then there's the hedonic adjustment, or the hedonic treadmill, right?
Yeah.
Where you kind of just you reset your expectations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's a nice way of illustrating this, is to ask people, well, would you rather have a job that pays 100k and everyone else in the company earns 90k, so you're earning more than everyone else, or would you rather have a job that pays 200k and everyone else is earning 250k? Right,
and then you'd rather have the.
You probably would rather have because in that little bubble you're you're earning more, so you feel more wealthy.
Yeah. So, just going back to the kind of reactance thing, you've written about the explore-exploit trade-off. Can you just explain that? Because, again, from an evolutionary perspective, it strikes me that, you know, different people play a different role, and you need a bit of both. But can you just tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's an algorithm from computer science that has been sort of applied to human behavior. I mean, one of the ways that people talk about it is to say that, for example, when you move to a new city, your optimal strategy, this is the kind of language that's used, is to explore as much as you can and find out, where the good spots are and your best route to work. But then once you've figured that out, it makes more sense to exploit what you've learned through your explorations and then just stick to that. So it's like trying to figure out, well, what are the trade-offs between exploring and then what are the advantages of actually just, exploiting what you've learned. So it's trying to think about that kind of dilemma.
Yeah, so I used to work with a guy, I won't mention his name, many years ago, who he did a stint at the company, and every day he went to Boots for lunch.
Right.
And he got the all-day breakfast, the Boots meal deal, which was an all-day breakfast sandwich.
Yeah.
I think it was a Diet Coke and a packet of ready salted crisps. And without fail, back when we were in the office 5 days a week for 3 months. And to some of us in the office, this was just absolutely mad.
Yeah.
Like, Gary, Barry, what are you doing? And he was an accountant, which may or may not, But is that, are there people who are more like that than others? Or is this behaviour that kind of is...
No, definitely. But I think one of the interesting things about it is, and I think Barry is not alone, because I remember Deliveroo did some research a few years ago. So whether we should trust this fully as slightly, take it with a pinch of salt, which is that something like 30% of people in the UK had the same lunch every single day. Yeah. And if you asked people on the 1st of January to choose all their lunches for the next 365 days, it would be pretty unusual for someone to say, yeah, I'm going to choose whatever he was having.
I'm going to pre-order the all-day breakfast sandwich.
Yeah. Not many people would do that, but the reality is that when you get in that situation and when you don't want to think about that decision, it's just the easy thing to do. So, we called that the ham sandwich fallacy, because the most popular lunch item was the ham sandwich for people, and they end up eating it every day.
Yeah. Does that feed in at all to your PhD thesis about the tragedy of the commons in any way? Is there any lessons that... Well, actually, let's step back. What is the tragedy of the commons? Okay.
So this is a concept that was introduced by an ecologist, Garrett Hardin, I think in the 1950s. And he wrote this paper in Science, and he asked readers to imagine a scenario where there's a group of farmers that have cattle, they each have a herd of cattle, that all graze on the common land. Right. And Hardin says, well, if you put yourself in each farmer's shoes, each farmer is going to think, okay, well, I could get another cow, and then I would get the full benefit of that, right? I can sell it for meat or milk or whatever. And the additional cost of overgrazing is shared by everyone. So I get the full benefit, and the cost is shared by everyone. And Hardin says, well, if every farmer thinks like this, which they might, then every farmer is going to get another cow, and then the commons is going to be overgrazed, and it's going to collapse, and that's going to be the tragedy of the commons. So some people say, well, this is a good metaphor, but in reality, surely the farmers would come together and say, hey guys, can you see what's happening? This is problematic. And they probably would, right? But it's a useful concept for thinking about climate change and these kind of global problems, because if you were to multiply the number of farmers to 5 billion or something, then you can see how coordinating actions becomes a lot more difficult, especially if you imagine, and this is where my PhD research kind of came in, if you imagine that some of the farmers are way richer than others, maybe some of the farmers are more vulnerable to collapse in some way, maybe some of the farmers historically have grazed the land to the point of overgrazing, So when you introduce all these dynamics as well, it becomes really, really difficult to reach agreements about what's fair. And that was really what I was looking at.
So my understanding of behaviour like this, I don't know if you ever came across Eleanor Ostrom.
Yeah.
I mean, I think she argued that people do kind of, like lobster farmers in Maine or forestry management by local communities in India. Like there is a sense. It's quite common actually for people to kind of come together and go like, we need to. And apparently, one of the pro-Brexit arguments I heard was that the common fisheries policy was when British fishing waters were fished solely by British fishermen, they had over generations learnt how to kind of replenish the feedstock and not overfish. And once the fishing waters became fair game for all, that tie to the water was lost, and the tragedy of commons became an issue. Mm-hmm. Is it when it comes to climate change an issue where you can't contextualize the downside? So I use a plastic bottle here, and the downside is felt in the ocean outside Indonesia. Yeah. So my kids don't come into it in a way because it's just too far away and remote. Is that where it's an issue more than it is with, I've forgotten the name of the fellow that...
Garrett Hardin.
With the farm and the cows. Yeah,
totally. And Ellen Ostrom is obviously right in that human communities successfully manage these common pool resources and have done that for, we've been around for 300,000 years by some estimates, 200,000 years by another estimates. We didn't necessarily have these problems very much at the time. But the challenge is when you scale up to many more people, all who have got competing interests, and when the cost of overfishing or overgrazing is spread so widely that it's barely perceptible. That's the challenge. David Hume was the Scottish philosopher. He wrote about this a few hundred years ago, where he said that it would be very easy if we had a common meadow and it became flooded. It would be very easy for two people to execute it, to execute the unflooding, the draining. Right. But for 1,000 people, it would be much more difficult because everyone would try to lay the burden on others, he says. Yeah. And this is kind of what's playing out.
And it's back to that kind of scale and emergent behaviour that you get with larger and larger groups. Yeah. Have you read James Surowiecki, Wisdom of Crowds?
Oh, no, but I know that,
so he kind of argues that the whole thing of like, if you've got a cow in the fair and everyone has to guess the weight of the cow, the average, everyone's answer is wrong, but the average of everyone's answer is correct. Yeah. Weirdly accurate, or guessing number of sweets in a jar. Yeah. Until unless someone shouts out a guess.
Oh, right, and then that derails it.
Then people anchor to that guess, obviously. But he talks in the book about mob behaviour. When does a protest turn into a mob? And there's that kind of tipping point where the ratio of kind of anarchist-minded people or violent-minded people exceeds 11% or whatever the number is. I'm making it up. Then you see the kind of the more peace-loving people leave. And so crowds are very wise when you have a diverse, and I don't mean diverse from a DEI or kind of racial or gender perspective, but more from a background perspective, more from like in its genuine sense. The diversity of a market gives it efficiency, and when you take people out of it, or when there's too much groupthink, is there? I mean, you're entering the kind of the world of academia. Do you think there's too much groupthink going on institutionally?
The answer is probably yes. Mainly in the sense of, there's this idea of like people have to die for the new ideas to. The old generation has to die. I can't remember Weber, I think. So the old generation has to die for the new ideas to take the place, and So I think, the dominant models, the dominant ways of thinking are just, you can't even see them, right? Because you're so baked in them. It's the how's the the fish with the water, how's the water boys? Do you know this?
No, go on. Yeah.
Well, it's there's two fish swimming along,
Right.
and then an older fish comes past and says, "Morning, how's the water boys?" And then the two little fish look confused. They're like, "What's water?"
Oh, right. Yeah.
So the models that scientists use in certain disciplines they shape the thinking to the extent that you can't even see it, and you're sort of trapped in this model and way of thinking that is sometimes difficult to break out of, to take a different path.
To the point where science, it's almost replacing religion in some ways.
Oh, totally, yeah. Science with
Do you
the capital S.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of cringe when someone says, "Believe the science," which is kind of almost like a weird phrase in itself.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. Or trust the science.
Yeah. We heard that a lot. Yeah. I mean, because there's always something political in there, right? There's always a way of thinking that's shaping the science, and you're always having to come to judgments. I mean, even cost-benefit analyses are often used as, like, oh, we did the science. But to try to put a financial cost or value on anything that's important in life, I don't know, health, love, friendship, you're having to make some pretty strange assumptions to get there. So even when you put it in a spreadsheet and it all looks very scientific or on an academic paper, there are so many assumptions underlying that it's never objective. It's always subjective. Yeah.
This is the issue I have with IQ. It's just kind of reducing intelligence to this score.
Yeah. Did you get a low score? Or
Yeah,
something?
yeah, slightly chippy about it. Well, I don't know. I think it's probably pretty good in the left tail. Like trying to, if you're going to get 30 out of 100, you're probably going to not be an astrophysicist. Let's say
potentially, yeah.
But is it that helpful in any other, a test that gives you one right answer out of 3 that are wrong, two others that are wrong? Real world doesn't behave like that. You can have 4 right answers, 5 right answers, and that issue of kind of being reductive is something that kind of frustrates me. Now, we talked about the kind of mob and violence and kind of anarchy. You've been thinking a lot about Marshall Sahlins. Yeah. Can you tell me about him?
Yeah, he's an anthropologist who died just a couple of years ago. But I only learned about him recently, and he's written a couple of lovely books, one of which is called The Western Illusion of Human Nature. And another one which I read recently was The New Science of the Enchanted Universe. And there's a few interesting ideas in there that I think I'm still germinating with me, but maybe we can run through a couple of them. So, in the Western Illusion of Human Nature, he's really making the point, it's related to what I was saying earlier, that the idea of the individual separate from society is a very Western thing, and it's a very strange thing. This is not. We are the weird ones in a way, right? By believing that. If you think about the rest of the world and also all of humanity, hundreds of thousands of years ago. The other thing that's in there that I think is worth discussing is this idea of self-interest, and this is one of the existing models, right? Certainly in economics, that people are self-interested, and that's the starting point. Okay, people are going about the world trying to maximize their utility, and they might care about other people, right? But that all adds to their utility.
And the homo economicus. Yeah,
exactly.
The rational thinker that's always maximizing there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of taken as, well, that's the assumption. Of course, that's true. But yeah, Marshall Sahlins is pointing out that this is an extraordinary idea as well. Actually, in the history of humanity, if someone was self-interested in the tribe, that would be hugely problematic, and you'd think that person is ill and needs help, or is not well. It's a disease almost, that narrow self-interest. a lot of I think the Creole communities in South America had a term huético, which was when they saw the Spanish, very much self-interested, thinking about money. They described them as having huético, which is like a fever, because they thought that this was a very ill way of being. So those are I think quite interesting ideas, things that we just take for granted that if we think about historically in context, maybe have not always been true.
And by Western, I'm guessing you mean Christian, because that kind of sovereignty of the individual sprung from Christianity. Therefore, you've been doing some work on something called the evolved nest. Has that kind of sprung from that issue of A, the tragedy of the commons, but B, also this sort of this over-focus on the individual?
Yeah, I think so. So,
how does it manifest itself, like practically?
Yeah, a feeling of disconnection from others, competitive detachment is the language that's often used, right?
Yeah.
We used to, 10,000 years ago, have societies of cooperative companionship, and they were partnership systems in which people worked together for the good of the community. And now we seem to be in a cycle of what's called competitive detachment. So the evolved nest is a concept developed by Darcia Narvaez. She's a psychologist at University of Notre Dame in Indiana. And it's really what we might call a social commons for the development of human nature. So it's really thinking about how we raise our young and how other animals raise their young.
Right.
And we can think about it as a set of practices that are designed to sort of nurture physical and psychological well-being. So it's things that all animals do for their young, all mammals do at least, extensive affectionate touch, self-directed free play, a kind of positive emotional climate, you feel welcome as a baby in the world, a sense of social embeddedness, nestedness in a community and togetherness, and all of these things help a child develop optimally. So there's the developmental nestedness that I think some cultures have, and historically this is how humans evolved to bring up their young. But in Western countries we've moved away from that in many ways, because
we've got two things happening. We've got single parent families where you can you struggle to even sort of get by.
Mm-hmm.
And actually in very similar ways, you've got two parent families where both parents are working full time or there or thereabouts, juggling work and childcare, and they're barely making ends meet, and they're feeling guilty constantly about actually spending enough time with their children.
And you're absolutely right. This report came out a few weeks ago from the US Surgeon General, who reported that I think almost half of American parents are stressed to the point of being completely overwhelmed. And so I think one of the challenges, and this is one of the chapters of the book, is about multiple caregivers.
Right.
In the West, often we have a nuclear family, and if we're lucky, there are some grandparents relatively close by who help out. Darcia Narvaez, the author, talks about how in a lot of other animals, like elephants and wolves, you've got aunties and grandmas and uncles and grandparents, and all of them contribute to the bringing up of this child. It's this idea of it takes a village, right? And we've maybe lost the village or separated ourselves from the village in many situations. Yeah,
because you get a job, you get offered a job, you're living in New York, you get offered a job in LA, your family's in New York, you go straight to LA because that's great for your career, or like it's a great opportunity. So you kind of you feel like you've got to do that.
For sure.
And both parents today either out of culturally or out of just financial economic need to work full time. But it's just something's got to give. I mean, my theory, for what it's worth, sadly, because I've got a financial economic background, I'll point people to 2 episodes ago with Fred Harrison. The cost of property, the cost of land, the cost of buying a home is so much because we allow land speculation, effectively. That just about everything you earn goes to rent.
Yeah.
Either capitalize rent by buying a property and you paying all that rent in one go, or by paying rent to a landlord. And something's gone wrong where you're commuting, the cost of living is so high because you're paying for someone else's rent because they've got to charge you more to kind of and that's again my problem. I'm coming at it from an economic standpoint. It sounds like you're coming at it from a more cultural standpoint. I'm sure both can be right at the same time, but do enough people actually recognise this problem, or do you find that actually, like when you watch the news or when you're reading The Economist or whatever it might be, that it's just we're not even on the button yet?
Yeah, it feels like we haven't quite understood how important those first years of life are. The human brain is only when the baby's born is a third of the size that it will be. So there's just all kinds, so much learning going on in those years. I think it's also important to say that this isn't about claiming that mothers should just be at home and not work, right?
Sure.
This is just saying that the nest is about, it takes the village, right? And it's finding social support in our social circles to bring children into the world in a sort of healthy, supportive way.
So what is, can you just, say her name, because you're saying it, I'm sure, pronouncing it perfectly in the...
It's Darcia Narvaez.
Darcia Narvaez.
Yeah.
So let's just spell it out for people listening.
Darcia. And then Narvaez is Narvaez.
She,
yeah.
does she, what's your solution?
I think there are multiple things. I mean, one of the first things is just making it easier or less stressful for parents to bring up kids, whether that's the cost of childcare and all the rest of it. But I think on a broader level, there are certain beliefs that we seem to have about what children need in our societies, and things like, don't pick the baby up because you're going to create a rod for your own back, or you're going to create
let it cry.
Or you're going to create a needy child. And so I think there needs to be a bit of a shift in just recognizing that we're social mammals. Actually, a cry is a distress call, and if our friend was crying, we'd go to them. And I know that's difficult, right? So I don't have kids right now, so everything I say, you're a parent, you know far better than me how difficult that is in practice. But I still think there are certain attitudes about what kids need based on certain ideas that have kind of continued for a number of decades that I think we should challenge now.
I feel like this is partly kind of luxury beliefs. Like, we didn't have the bandwidth however many thousand years ago to worry about this stuff. Love was just was what you did when you didn't have time, when you weren't working. Whereas now it feels like we overthink, I won't pick the baby up because that will make me a bad parent and it will set back. It's almost a luxury that's creating this misery.
But I think a lot of it comes down to maybe reconnecting with our intuitions and ourselves, and you have a very strong urge in that moment to pick up the baby, right? But then at the same time you're
telling yourself
you're in this should I, shouldn't I, when I think we just need to trust ourselves a bit more. These things are baked into our biology.
Okay, and then also you mentioned living near people who are going to help you out, and I think there's been some technology attempts at doing this where you have apps that, you find fellow parents with, or, you've got NCT child groups and that stuff, but it just doesn't seem to be addressing the issue that having an auntie wolf nearby, that's just, I'm stuck at work, I'm stuck in traffic, can you go and pick up little Daisy or whatever? We've just become detached because we want to go off and do our own thing. Yeah,
that's probably true in a lot of cases. And I think a lot of Darcia's research has shown that actually having social support around you is hugely important, both for your own levels of well-being, but obviously the baby's going to going to pick up on that and be positively and negatively affected by that as well. So yeah.
You mentioned Japan. What do they do differently, if anything? Or are they running into the same issues?
No, I think their childhood is seen as a time of wonder and a unique time that you will never get again. So They treat children in a way, there's no, oh, you need to act this way because of this. It's very much just let the child be the child and don't worry about spoiling the child like we worry about, because the risks of not spoiling the child are far greater than the risk of over spoiling the child. They'll kind of grow out of it. They also really takes the village mentality to a whole new level. I mean, you see when you're in Japan, you see really young kids getting the train to go to school unaccompanied by adults. And they look unaccompanied, right? Because there's not a parent standing with them, but actually everyone's looking out for them. So Japan's almost a tribe in that way, but a tribe on a
And does this have no relation? It may not no relation to the fact they're not having kids. Is that a separate issue?
I think that's a separate issue, because that's also a kind of global thing.
Yeah.
Fewer people having kids across the world for a variety of reasons. Yeah. I think South Korea is the lowest. Yeah.
They're gonna lose 30% of their population in.
Yeah.
And we also, I guess it goes full circle because we don't look after our elderly either.
Yeah.
That's part of this whole thing, right? And even the elderly are I know in my upbringing there was an almost expectation that, when with my grandparents or whatever, when I'm old, you're going to look after me.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas now, you speak to grandparents today, they're like, I just don't want to be a burden. I don't want to be like, you do you, I'll do me, and actually that respect for the older generation is the same issue. Is it the same issue as the love that we're not giving to the younger as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things on that is Gabor Mate talks about how there's some societies that refer to the elderly as elders. That's a completely different language to describe those people, right? That suggests sort of wisdom rather than frail people. The other thing about grandparents is that they have a way of connecting with kids that I think parents, and I would imagine it's hard to do, right? Because as a parent, like our age, we've got all our stuff going on. We've got our careers to juggle. We're a little bit stressed about stuff. Grandparents are out the other side of that. Yeah. They're able to just get on a level that
my kids have a very different relationship with my in-laws, my parents, and it's really healthy in a way that
So what do you think?
Well, they just they just have a different dynamic, and it's a different form of respect and play. It's even hard to articulate, but they'll want to hang out with them, and they won't want to hang out with you, and then sometimes they want to hang out, and it's just so nice to have. And I wish more if there are people out there that don't have that, I really want them to have it because it's very important. And I'm guessing in Japan, in other cultures it is more prevalent. Whereas I know plenty of people who live very far away from their grandparents. Plenty of people who have kids who live far away from their parents. Yeah.
And that comes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? It's
with happiness
and being an individual. There's a separation there baked into our society that there isn't in some of these other places. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that I've been grappling with is it's obvious to say that a lot of people who've caused most harm in the world have had the most troubled childhoods. However, it seems like the same is true at the other end of the scale. A lot of people in the world who have achieved a lot, I'll put achieve in inverted commas for people listening, have also had quite troubled childhoods, have had some sort of, inner fight.
Yeah.
To make them either they're trying to prove something.
Tiger Woods.
Tiger
Woods, Andre Agassi. Yeah.
I always get made fun of by a couple of my friends. I can't go a podcast without mentioning Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, all these people, it's that overcoming adversity seems to be, and this is something that religions seem to have picked up on, is key to the human condition. So like happiness, maybe pursuing happiness as a metric to quantify is a fool's errand, because actually what we need is the struggle and overcoming it, rather than happiness. Okay, put it another way, happiness doesn't exist in the present. It's either a memory, oh, that was a happy time when we went on that holiday, or when we were living in that part of the country, when I was working there and you were doing that was a happy time.
Yeah.
And it also exists in the future.
Yeah.
It's like one day, we're gonna, the kids are going to be able to dress themselves, or we're going to, have enough money to do this, that, or the other, whatever it is. And so it's, in the meantime, what we are good at is feeling like we're getting from A to B. It's the journey, not the reward kind of mindset, which a lot of these entrepreneurs, all of these people, they like the process rather than the trophy. Kobe Bryant, wins a championship, next morning he's on the court training. Not because he's not happy to win the championship, but he doesn't get his reward from the championship, he gets his reward from the training. And if a lot of this, it's easier to measure GDP than it is happiness. Is that something that I'm guessing I'm kind of disagreeing with a lot of what you're saying there?
No, I think whether aiming for happiness is the right target is an open question, right? Because if we all, it's not something you can aim for and achieve by aiming for it. It sort of happens as a byproduct of other things. The journey point is definitely interesting as well, right? I think Dostoevsky has this nice line in Notes from Underground where he writes about how man is constantly trying to achieve things, but then is immediately depressed once he's achieved that thing. And he says, and this is of course a terribly comical thing. This is why man is a sort of hilarious creature. So that's why I would maybe say, we can measure happiness, but I would more talk about well-being, because I think that, or even health, if you take a broader definition of health, meaning kind of wholeness and so it's not really how happy are you right now, because as you say, that doesn't necessarily get at what you're trying to get at. It's more trying to understand, like, are you flourishing? Are you fulfilled in life? Are you getting from A to B? And I think the part of the problem in the West, I don't know what the cause is, but there's a lot of people who just don't feel any sense of they're stuck at A. And if you look at, forgive me, if we look at GDP per capita in the UK, for example, for the last 200 years, it's grown steadily at 2.3%. Come World War, come whatever, whatever government, Labour, Liberals, Conservatives, up until 2010. And it's been flat, it's flatlined. And there's all sorts of theories as to why that's happened, but I think we certainly, that's where maybe GDP and happiness, well-being can relate, because you're not getting that, no matter how hard I try, all I'm doing is covering my rent. And it's probably not going to be any better for my kids than it is for me. We've reached the end of, the technology is not going to help, because we've reached the end of the laws of physics. The trains can only go so fast. And so I guess removing barriers to improving your well-being by enabling you to pursue your dreams is how you, but it just sounds quite fluffy. Yeah, potentially. But one of the interesting other bits of research that Richard Easterlin of the Easterlin Paradox did, he was looking at what does increase happiness over time, and it was actually just more things related to the welfare state, right? Like more unemployment insurance. So just knowing that if you lose your job, you're not going to be left in the lurch, removes a huge amount of stress from your everyday life. So we could measure I mean, I often ask people this question, like, if not GDP, what should we be measuring? And people say, oh yeah, maybe happiness. But I don't think we've come to a good alternative. I mean, maybe the answer is multiple things, but...
it is, probably.
Yeah.
But like even inequality in itself is not that useful.
Yeah.
Because it only makes sense over time. If and Thaler talks about this, you've got static inequality and you've got dynamic inequality. So America is the example he uses where the top richest families in one generation tend to be replaced by a set of people that were very poor at the time when the previous generation of very wealthy people were very rich.
Right.
And you get this kind of, the turnover at the top, whilst the gap between the rich and poor is very wide, the turnover is quite large.
Okay.
Whereas the example he gives is Italy, where apparently the same 10 families have been in the top 20 richest families for the last 600 years. Right, so you it's the direction of travel, the turnover that's more important than the static number. Because that's where you feel like, well, why do I bother? Because it's only going to be the Ferraris or whoever it is, the Fiat family, that are going to control the Medici. I don't know who it is in that list, but and for that you need kind of that Schumpeterian creative destruction. So you need people to be able to fail, which America celebrates. You know, you tried, you failed. Whereas I sense here, you know, everyone's a lawyer. And their job is kind of like, well, that wouldn't work. That's a stupid idea. You know, the Rory Sullivan talks about, you know, the Red Bull or the Dyson Hoover or something. Kind of, I could tell you for free that's never going to work. So, it's a challenge.
I also kind of wonder what B is at the moment. If we're at A, it's. Are we, you know, we seem to be talking a lot about economic growth still, and we know that if you have sort of compound growth, that ends up being an exponential curve, and we know that you can't have exponential growth on a finite planet. So it's like we seem to be sort of saying, economic growth for the next 10, 20 years, but is that the vision for the next 100 years? I don't know, and if it's not, then I don't know how clear it is what the vision is. It feels at the moment for it. Maybe I'm projecting.
Okay, so if you listen to Jordan Peterson, he will say, let's take the climate change issue. You want people to behave responsibly for the planet, which is actually a very conservative mindset in some camps. You know, Edmund Burke talks about we have a responsibility to the elderly, the born and the not yet born. Kind of, you know, that you've got to think about future generations when it comes to debt and spending, but also kind of the planet. What Peterson would argue is what we need to do is get people as rich as possible as quickly as possible, because only then do you have the bandwidth to kind of go, actually, should I won't use a plastic bottle, I'll use a, you know, whatever. Or I'm not going to burn wood, I'm going to get a cleaner source, I'm going to get a solar panel. And that comes with having that baseline covered. So the wealthier countries get, the more conscious they are of I can see you're kind of tutting.
Well,
and it's there to be challenged. So give me.
Well, I think it's a problematic idea of how humans think. I mean, coming back to what I was saying before about we get wealthier and then our expectations just increase and well-being flatlines, and the sense of having enough. Oh, now I've got the bandwidth to think about the climate stuff. Well, it's not really clear that in our current way of thinking we have this psychology of what is enough.
Right.
So but unless you fundamentally change that way of thinking about what we actually need, what is enough, unless we have that conversation, then I think that just sort of increases, luxuries become necessities, and then you never actually have the bandwidth.
Okay, so my pushback to that is you're absolutely right. Nothing's ever enough. But
unless you're a Zen Buddhist or something, a monk.
Unless you've detached yourself from the body and from temporal proclivity. But yes, nothing's ever enough, but your priorities change. So your worries, you'll give that hedonic treadmill, you adjust, but you just create new worries for yourself.
Yeah.
So, I know someone who said, look, again, I think Taleb talks about this again. You kind of worry about you get to a certain level of wealth, you just start worrying about your staff not working hard enough.
Right.
I know someone who said, look, it really irritates me. He's done rather well in life. The house servants they don't lift my shirts high enough when they bring them back from the laundry, so I can see the cuffs dragging on the floor, and I want to say, like, why would you do that? And, so like you sure, your mindset doesn't change. Before you were worrying about, should I have a TV license or not? Do I, can I afford this, that, and the other? But now you're like worrying about whether, too much meat is good for the planet. But you're worrying, and it's not enough to the answer. But at least then you're creating behaviour patterns that are better.
Yeah.
Externally, because you're.
Yeah, no, I agree to a point, right? So I think if you're in that sort of subsistence living where you're struggling from day to day, of course
you're burning wood, you're foraging, whatever. Yeah.
Of course, you can't be thinking about these sort of questions. But where I would disagree is at what point that
there's plenty of people who are wealthy who don't give a crap.
Yeah. Who do have the bandwidth, but are not. Yeah.
But that's changing, I think.
And actually, that's one of the interesting inequalities, is that it's the top 10% who have the way bigger carbon footprint than the bottom 90%. So they're the ones who should have the bandwidth, but
I mean, that's the private jet thing, right?
Yeah, and the yachts I think aren't great either.
No. Let's switch track. You've done a bit of work for Richard Thaler. Thaler, both were wrong. Who I believe, not that I'm one for the expert fallacy, but I believe you won a Nobel Prize.
He did,
for economics.
Yeah.
Can you just explain for people who aren't on top of their behavioural economics, what is nudge theory, and tell us some of the work that you've done with him.
Yeah, sure. Well, a nudge is a kind of contested definition, but it's really anything where you're changing the sort of decision environment,
right?
But you're not actually making it more difficult to make one decision or another. You're not kind of making it very costly to choose A over B. You're just changing the way that A and B are presented. So
you're reframing.
Yeah, you might be reframing. You might be doing something as simple as putting a ridged white line on the motorway, so that if you drift a little bit, it just brings you back into line. It's just a little nudge. You can, if you want to drive off the road, you can drive off the road, right? But it's just something to keep you in the middle of the lane. It's been applied to a huge number of public policies. I mean, things like pension, auto-enrollment in pensions is quite a good example. Okay, I think before 2012, when you joined a new company, you had to actively opt in. Yeah, right?
Yeah.
But after that, you were enrolled unless you wanted to opt out. Yeah. And it's really easy for you to do that. You just say no thanks. But it quite significantly shifts the number of people who actually do that, and then they end up sort of saving more money. So it's quite a nice example of you've not made people's lives more difficult, you've just slightly changed the way that the choices are presented, or the way that the default works, and you've come to a nice solution that seems to be quite effective. So one of the bits, so this way of thinking was kind of tried to be applied to lots of other public policies, and one of the things that I helped out with was on organ donation.
Right.
And this is one where it sort of makes sense, right? You think, okay, well, we'll change the default from you're out.
You're a donor unless you choose otherwise.
Exactly. So we switch to presumed consent.
Yeah.
And a couple of decades ago, this paper came out and it showed that if you do that, well, you get way more people on the organ donor registry. I guess the issue is that you're not really interested in how many people are on the organ donor registry. You're interested at the end of the day in how many organs are successfully donated or transplanted.
Right.
And so what Thaler has been saying is actually this is not a policy where changing the default is a particularly effective solution. And the reason is that the families are always asked for consent.
Okay, so even if you're on the list, you can be vetoed by...
Yeah. And you being on the list, having not opted out, is that really a signal of your commitment to donating your organs?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I don't know what my dad's previous opinion was, but he was a recipient of a kidney,
right? And
now he's very I'm gonna, whatever anyone needs of me inside me is fair game. So he's very active in that role. But you're saying that even if you opted in, it wasn't enough.
Yeah, because your family will always be asked. So I think Thaler's point and the research that I ended up doing was about England and Wales, because you had this nice example of where Wales changed the default in, I think it was 2015, to presumed consent.
Right.
And then England did it 5 years later. And it's the same trust, right? So you had this nice example of, this is all run by the NHS, and you've got one area that switched the default and one that didn't. And obviously 5 years is not really long enough to make any kind of conclusions about what worked, but it doesn't... The main thing driving any increase in organ donations seems to be the fact that you do a big media campaign, you say we're going to change the default, and that's the thing that kind of gets people to actually register, and that's what it seems to be a better policy tool, is to try to get people to make an explicit choice, because then, if they do die, it's like, well, they've made their wishes clear in a way that if they're just presumed to have consented, it's a little bit less clear. So Italy's a great example. In the organ donation sort of legal writing, it says, we have a system of presumed consent, but in practice, it's nominal. It doesn't actually get... I think there's a couple of countries where if you don't turn up as a family, they can legally take your organs because they've presumed that you've consented, but it's pretty rare. So it's just an interesting example, because it's one where people say, nudging, great for organ donation, but it's a little bit more complicated than that.
So what is there anything that you believe now, or you have strong views on, that you didn't, or you either thought the opposite of 2 years ago, let's say, that you've changed your mind on, or has it been more of a journey? I think the thing that's coming to mind is 2 years ago, I spent 2 months in Japan on a research trip. Right.
And it was a time where they still had closed the borders to tourists. So it was just me and no tourists and Japan. Occasionally I'd see like a European on the street, and we'd have a chat and say, how did you get here? And so I had a lot of time there to observe and think about and reflect on what I was observing. And one of the things I really noticed was, just things, I had often thought about things like, littering on the streets or homelessness. These are just societal problems that when you have a big group of people, they're just the way the system is, and it's just that's just really difficult, and they can't be solved very easily. But in Japan, it's like there's no litter on the streets. And there's very, very few homeless people. And it's like, actually, if the priorities are set right, then you actually can do these things. It's doable. It's not beyond the... So I think that maybe what I'd say, is what is possible became a kind of more open prospect. There's an interesting... I don't know if it's sustained itself, but when the Prime Minister of India first came into power, I think in 2014, he did a social media challenge. Do you remember the Ice Bucket Challenge? Yeah. I think I did one. Yeah. You did one, did you? Yeah. You were nominated. It wasn't me, was it? No. He did something similar to the Ice Bucket Challenge, where he kind of went out on the front doorstep and he cleaned up. India has a kind of cleanliness problem. Right. Has had a cleanliness problem for a while, where people are very clean in their homes, but they're less littering. Not saying everyone's literate there, but it's an issue. And so he got someone to film him on his social media team, kind of clearing up
the area outside his home. Excuse me. And then he nominated 4 celebrities to do the same.
All right.
And then very quickly you had like bank branches compete, you know, like the top 3 leading banks in the country had they like put a thing out, because this is kicking off on social media, you're going to clean up all your branches outside and you're going to put it on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because and then it just created this little cascade of behavior just from one. I don't know if is it a butterfly effect? I don't know what it is. But it these things can be fixed.
Yeah.
And another thing they did in India was they would if they have an issue of like public defecation, like people used to have these underpasses which were kind of people used to use as conveniences, public conveniences, and they put pictures of Ganesh up.
Oh, right.
And that stopped. All of a sudden it stopped, and you ended up getting, where people were peeing, you'd get flowers. People started making it beautiful. So like that framing.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a nudge?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's just changing the environment in some way.
Yeah.
You haven't banned, a traditional policy tool here would be to say, right, we're going to ban or give people fines for weeing in underpasses. But I guess that's what nudge is all about, is saying, well, there are different ways to try to... Does it give you hope that... I mean, it seems like behavioural psychology has kind of exploded over the last... maybe only because I got interested in it and I see it everywhere 10 years ago, but it's now entered the lexicon. Confirmation bias talks about it, people like to say that. What's the future for your field? What's next? What would you like to see done more of? Or what frustrates you that you would like to see done less of? I think a lot of the focus has been on the individual. Yeah. Right? There's a problem, and we can change behaviour by nudging this individual person in this way. To enrol in their pension, for example. Yeah. And that has potentially distracted us from system change and thinking about things in systems with emergent properties and complexities that may actually be needed. Like, can we nudge our way to hitting the 2-degree climate change, global warming target? Almost certainly not, right? There's a system change that needs to happen. I think that's where... This is your work on collective action. Yeah. Right? We have to think more in systems and big groups of people rather than trying to nudge individual behaviour. I think we've probably mined that mine. So what are successful examples in history of collective action? I mean, there's hundreds. I mean, lots of these kind of things where you have these ripple effects, these movements start. I mean, Martin Luther King's collective action. I mean, lots of environmental examples of things being successful. I'm trying. There's a nice example from India, actually. I think it was someone. I think it was Gandhi's mentor or someone Gandhi was kind of associated with, who went around door to door asking all the rich to give up some of their land. Right. And they actually did. So Satish Kumar talks about this a lot. I should check but it was one of these examples of going around and saying, hey, look, you've got lots. Can you give up some? Door to door, and it generates. Yeah, this happened in the French. Ringing a bell? In the French, well, no, it doesn't. But it reminds me of something. I've for some reason got interested in the French Revolution recently, because that's a really interesting example of like collective behaviour that was sparked by a combination of different things happening at the same time: high levels of debt, social unrest because of poor economic behaviour, successive poor harvests, like just bad luck. So you had 3 or 4 bad years and then at the same time you've got a change in the kind of the laboratory of ideas. So Rousseau's big, and Voltaire, all this sort of like, a bit of the individual and the new beginnings today. Tomorrow is different to yesterday, and that created this what started off as an evolution turning into a revolution that would turn out to be incredibly bloody.
And there was a moment when, after the Bastille had been stormed, where the nobility and the clergy all got together and just started, yes, we'll give up our rights to be able to, shoot any animals on our land or stopping people from foraging. And then the clergy go, yes, and we'll give up our rights to kind of own the land around our churches. And there was this kind of collective action of just giving stuff up, which the church actually apparently did very badly out of. But it was this sort of, it was a very rare moment in history where people were kind of giving stuff up because it was what everyone else was doing. So we might need that again at some point.
Yeah, I mean, we do it in some circles of life. I mean, democracy is kind of a big collective action problem. Voting is, your vote doesn't really matter. Can't change anything, but we all need to do that together to
and I know people who don't vote for that reason.
Oh, right.
And it's actually very hard to, maybe I need to think about, well, what would you say to them?
I'd ask them why. Yeah, what's driving that?
Well, it's that what you just said. That it doesn't. If I don't vote, what difference does it make? There's a 3,000 majority in the constituency. Yeah. Maybe this one's going to lose 2,000. It's very.
Yeah, but I think I would say that the idea of democracy depends on everyone buying into it.
Yeah.
And so it's that whole thing. Well, if everyone thought like that, it would collapse. So therefore, I'm not going to contribute to that. I'm going to contribute to it surviving and flourishing.
I think also this perhaps pendulum swing towards the individual has also resulted in too much faith maybe being put in the ballot box alone. Like, so, you get frustrated with voting because it doesn't matter what party's in power, it's all the same shit kind of thing comes, and people say that. But that's fine. But democracy or liberal government or whatever it is, whatever you want to define it as, isn't just at the ballot box. It's also about participating in between elections and making your opinion felt or heard. And people are, especially conservatives actually, are kind of leave me alone and then I'll vote every 5 years. Whereas actually, people on the left are much better at kind of getting involved and getting their voice out there. And you need to, give as good as you get. And I had a little skim of Sarling's essay. I'm sorry, but it's 116 pages is not an essay, it's a book, but you said it was an essay, so I gave it a go. And he puts it really, really well, I think. There's this kind of balance between anarchy, equality, and what is it? I've actually written it down because and hierarchy.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
So Thucydides talks about the anarchy that came in the Peloponnesian War. Yeah. And that was an inspiration for Hobbes to say, during the English Civil War, to run up to the English Civil War, look, we don't want that anarchy. We need a hierarchy with a sovereign to maintain order. Yeah. And then John Adams in America said, well, yes, we need some sort of hierarchy, but we also need equality. And by equality, he didn't mean sort of socialism, but more a balance of power between a separation of a judiciary and a legislature and an executive branch, and having checks and balances so that no one person. That kind of balance is one that I think you need everyone's buy-in rather than just turning up every 5 years and voting. And maybe that's a way to get at these people and say, voting may not matter that much, but you can collectively. Okay, well, this is something I hear a lot. There's an election happening right now in America, and I hear a lot, I can't believe these are the best two people we could choose. Yeah. But you kind of get the candidates you deserve unless you get involved yourself.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think it's also quite reasonable to feel a bit disillusioned, right? It's a slightly strange system that your vote doesn't really count, and then some representatives do some stuff that they put on this big manifesto that no one read. And so there's a lot of people in the UK, there's an organisation called Demos, who I'm hopefully doing some work with, who are trying to make democracy more collaborative and participatory.
Yeah.
So doing things like citizens' assemblies, where you get a representative sample of 100 people, and you spend 3 or 4 days debating a local policy issue, and you hear all perspectives, and together you find a way that works for everyone, that involves compromises and trade-offs. But so I think if we can shift more in that direction, that might help to restore people's faith in democracy a little bit more.
I mean, it feels like it transcends left and right. You get involved, go and do the beach clean, go and turn up at the local council, make your voice heard.
Yeah.
As you know, I like to wrap up these conversations with something which goes against the grain of all good behavioural economists, which is a 10-year prediction. Yeah. I know predictions are nothing more than tax-free entertainment, but for the purposes of this, it's purely for entertainment purposes. You're not going to be held to it. So you have a 10-year time horizon.
Okay.
Why 10 years? Because it's long enough to be meaningful, but not so far away that you're not going to be held accountable for it, because it's no one's it's 40 years away or whatever it is. So, and you're allowed to choose something that you would like to happen, or something that you think will happen. And if it's something you'd like to happen, answers such as world peace or people being kind to each other are to be discouraged if possible.
Okay. Do you have a favourite so far that has come up?
Oh, very good question. I tell you what.
Just to buy myself some time.
No. I can ramble. I think what's been interesting is the I think it's something like 6 out of the 10 are negative, or 7 out of the 10 are negative predictions.
Okay.
And only 3 have been sort of ones that have been positive. So we've had someone saying social disorder is going to get worse because we've all the cuts we've made to childcare and local communities is going to manifest itself now in youth disorder. We're going to have a property recession. We're going to have what else have we had? So not particularly optimistic views. But then I had Nigel McGilchrist say that we're going to be quite adaptive. We're going to have different types of living to respond to climate change, like cities and in bubbles or whatever it might be. So it's been a range, but the more entrepreneurial ones have been more optimistic, I would say, and the kind of more financial ones have been pessimistic.
I think I would link actually to what we were just talking about, because if I think about a 10-year horizon, I naturally think back to 2014. Okay. And
which feels like yesterday in some ways, which tells you how short this bet is.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about it from a sort of climate change perspective. I guess this has been a lot of my research, so it's always in mind. And I think in 2014, climate change was at the forefront of political discussion, but it feels, my memory is difficult to know how much to rely on that from 2014, but it felt like at the time this was something that would come in a few decades. So it's a problem, but this is not going to start to bite until 2050 or 2070 or whatever. Whereas I think now it's very apparent that it is starting to bite. There's already deaths happening due to man-made climate change. There's already huge disruption to lives due to extreme weather. And so I think that in the next 10 years, we're hopefully, so I'm doing a hope and a prediction in one, going to go from thinking about this as, it's this problem that needs to be solved by our elected representatives who go to a yearly conference and negotiate about it, to realizing that actually every decision we make matters. And it's a local thing. And if we can just focus on the community and those around us and the decisions that we make, then you do get these kind of ripple effects and movements that grow. And So yeah, I think a growing realization that, yeah, everything we do matters. And also everything that we do for the good of the natural world is also tends to be good for ourselves and our community.
Yeah, we feel better about it.
Yeah, it's
you
not
do the
like,
beach clean and you do that.
Yeah. It's not like, I don't know, if you go to a park instead of go spend a load of money in a shopping centre, that you think, oh yeah, I should have gone to the shopping centre, you know. Or I don't know, if you walk or cycle rather than drive, you know, you tend to, it's a healthier decision for you. So it's not like there's this conflict between the thing that's good for the natural world and the thing that is good for you, right? So hopefully a kind of growing realization of that, and then with that a movement of more local political action.
Yeah. So we're at a tipping point, you're predicting, where people will be more invested at the base, you know, a base camp versus, you know, this is for Ed Miliband to solve. Like COP20, whatever. And my I hope that's right. My beef with the whole climate debate, you know, is there a debate? Yeah, there is. But is that we've wrapped it in paternalism in many ways. And we've tried to, we've lost about 10, 20 years by trying to patronize people and tell them what to do and tell them they're awful. And that they're, you know, and B, by almost being mendacious. Now, I'm not fixed on this. I'm happy to be proved wrong, but like Peter Thiel talks about, you know, if you have to put science on the end of something, it probably isn't a science. So like, which I know there's behavioural science, but like, you know, you don't say chemistry science, right? But climate science. Yeah. You know, can you model something that is complex? It's in extremistan, as Taleb says, not mediocristan. So, you know, we frame this as a scientific issue, but people have been skeptical because it's like, well, you know, that's, you know, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 1 degree. Well, how did you get to 2 degrees? You know, well, how did you get to 2027? You know, you're making this up. And actually, they probably are making this up. But instead, what we should have been doing is going, the Earth is a fragile thing. It's a complicated thing. Things interact with each other. Things set off other things that we don't know, we can't predict. So let's behave as if it's fucked, and then act as if... So rather than like spoon feeding people junk science, you kind of tell them about risk management and go like, you know, we need to behave. We've only got one planet. It's not. And I hope that that could be the way to say, like, to make people aware of the fragility, but not try and tell them that, you know, it's because there's 3.7 degrees of warming that is going to happen that's going to create floods.
Yeah, I completely agree, and maybe I'll just add that there's this quite nice idea that our relationship with the natural world is a reflection of our relationship with ourselves.
Right.
And you can't separate those things. So when we do harm to the natural world, we're actually, in the long run, just harming ourselves. Yeah. And
it's quite spiritual.
Very.
Okay.
But it's just recognizing that we've always existed in a sort of reciprocal relationship with the world. And so, yeah, when we're acting because we want to hit the 2.7 degree target, that kind of misses the point. Ultimately, it's just about a fundamental shift in the way that we think about
our relationship with the earth.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I find, religion is like I think it's I always forget which way around. The first law of thermodynamics is like, it's neither created nor destroyed. It's just shifted from one Christianity to now, you've got the climate, it is a religion, you've got the science is settled, trust the science, believe in the science, and then you've got the prophet of Greta that is, is the kind of Joan of Arc or whatever, and it's just not the right way to get people to change their behavior. Mm-hmm. They need to feel invested in it. And I think we are getting there, actually.
I think so. There's definitely there's definitely a growing movement. I mean, I think there are also lessons to be learned from religion. If you think about how religions try to shape behavior, you come to a church every week and you pray, and then you're reminded of all these lessons of how to behave constantly, and then you pray every night and you confess, or there are so many rituals baked in that remind you, because otherwise you'll forget. It's this constant, this is how you need to behave in the world. So I'm not saying we need to go down that route.
No, but we have maybe lost something, or there's the baby's gone with the bathwater, maybe, because what we don't have anything now is to going back to the evolved nest. We have no levelers, right? On a Sunday, you sit in the same pew as the wealthy lord, and you're the chimney sweep or whatever. And now we're stratified. There's nothing to bring us together. And I remember in COVID when I was living in London and we were going to get married. Me and my wife and I were set to get married in the local church, and so we made a better effort to sort of turn up a bit more than we would have done because we wanted a church wedding, and there was a carol service outside the church because you weren't allowed in, and people just walked past and stopped and joined in. It was a nice frosty kind of winter evening as well. That kind of brought it to life. But you definitely sensed in those kind of that COVID darkness that it didn't matter if you were, rich or poor. You're going to stand next to someone and have a little sing song.
Yeah.
Which sounds banal, but we may have lost that source of nesting in the spiritual sense, which may be hard to recreate. But I hope not.
Me too.
Well, look, keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Because, as you're right, maybe we don't need to revive Christianity to get the nest back. But I'd love to do this again, and I'm really grateful you spared the time. It's been a real blast.
Yeah.
So before I sign off, where can people find you?
On Google, I think I have a website.
Yeah. EugeneMalthouse.co.uk?
No, I think it's one of the free Google ones. So what is it? sites.google.com/Eugene Malthouse, something like that. I also should give a plug for Bristol Talks, which is a platform.
Tell us about Bristol Talks.
Yeah, a platform I set up with my wife a few weeks ago, which, for any Bristol listeners, advertises or spreads the word about all the good things going on in Bristol. So that's happening as well. I think.
Well, good luck with that, because that sounds like a really, really decent endeavour. bristoltalks.co.uk?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, everyone go and have a look at that. I'll put it in the show notes.
Sure.
And let's do this again, please.
That'd be great.
Good man. This has been Meeting People. I've been your host, Amal Pandya. This is a podcast produced by Matt Cooper with music composed by Loverman.